Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. This video is going to be my Geekly Wrap-Up for November 4th through November 10th. Strap yourselves in because this week I managed to read 9 books. I DNF'd 1 book and I played the same board game 3 times. So let's go ahead and do the books. These are kind of loosely organized based off of readathons. So here's the first book that I read, which was actually not for any particular readathon, and that was Superman Smashes the Klan, Volume 1 of 3. This is written by Jean Luen Yang and illustrated by Gurihiru. This is basically a new comic book adaptation of the smash hit radio play that took place in, I believe, like the 1930s and 40s, where Superman takes down a fictional analog of the Ku Klux Klan, and the radio play was actually used to spread secretive information that enabled people in the real world to take down the real-life Klan. I am really enjoying reading this book. Jean Luen Yang is one of my favorite comics creators and writers, and I just love the way that he writes. And this book follows 2 Chinese-American protagonists. There's a little boy and a girl, and their family has just recently moved from Chinatown to a majority white neighborhood, and they are starting to get like these racist threats and like people trying to smash their windows and commit other acts of violence and intimidation where they are. And it is a story about how the girl and the boy are reacting to this differently, and also Superman's involvement because, as you may know, Superman is also somebody who is an immigrant to this planet from another place. This book is really clever, and I cannot wait to read more in the series. Next, we'll go through the books that I was reading for Believathon, which is the children's literature readathon that I'm doing for this month. First up is going to be my DNF. I actually DNF'd Frostheart, which is the group book for Believathon, because I just could not get into this book at all, which is a real shame. It sounded like it was going to be a great book, and it just wasn't. I feel that the writing just fell super flat for me. I thought that the author, who's trained as an illustrator, really let the character building and world building come through more in his illustrations than in his writing. And I just think that, like, as an adult reading this book, there wasn't much here to hold my interest. I don't know. I think that maybe some kids would enjoy it, but it wasn't for me. I think it would have made a really excellent graphic novel, though. So there's that. This book also did, like, one of my very least favorite things in books. Actually, 2 of them. Let's make that 2, which is the school of capitalization equals world building. So they keep capitalizing the word song and singer and song weaver and stuff like that. Like, okay, we get it. This is capitalized because you really want us to think that it's important. Thank you to Erin, if you're watching this, for listening to me rant about this book. I did read 4 other books this week for Believathon. Unintentionally, all of these ended up being books about the Holocaust. So again, there's going to be some Holocaust discussion and material here, just so you're aware of that. The first one was called Yellow Star, and it is a middle grade book written by Jennifer Roy. This is actually a really amazing true story that is based on the author's aunt's testimony. So the author did not intend to sit down and write a children's book about the Holocaust, but she had her aunt, who was one of the 12 children that survived the Lodz ghetto in Poland, sit down and do like an oral history, and eventually, the author wanted to make it into a book. It's written in free verse, and it tells the story of her aunt Sivia, as she was known then, basically just being a child that had to be hidden inside of the ghetto from the Nazis during the liquidation, and how there were just so many times when this child came so close to death, and often it was something as simple as just refusing to get in line or turning around when the Nazis tried to get everybody to line up to get on transports to the death camps. This was a truly powerful story, and I made this whole Twitter thread about reading Holocaust literature for this readathon, but I will say that I know that while this readathon is a lot about discovering the magic of children's literature, this week really brought home that it is about discovering the power of children's literature as well, and the powerful voices that these stories have, and the importance of witnessing and listening to the stories that they have to share. So that was Yellow Star. The second book is called The Safest Lie by Angela Cerrito. This is another middle grade book that is about a girl named Anna Bauman, who is one of the children that was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto by Irena Sendler, who was a Polish woman that basically just saw it as her moral imperative to help rescue Jewish children from death in concentration camps and death camps. So this actually, the author said that she was inspired to write the book after learning about Irena Sendler, but the book isn't about Irena Sendler. The book is actually about the children that she rescues and the hardships that they had to go through, basically like pretending to be assimilated into wider Polish Catholic society, and how they basically had to live secret double lives, and the kind of effect that that sort of trauma and bifurcation of your identity has on a very young child. Okay, I then also read another book that I had on my Kindle, so I can't hold it up, and that is called Run Boy Run. And the author's name is Yuri Orlov. This is another one that's based off of a true story, although I didn't realize that until after I read the book, that the protagonist is a real person. This is just a novel about his boyhood, and the author is also a Holocaust survivor. So this is a story about a boy who pretends to go by the name of Jurek Staniak, and he is a Polish Jewish boy that basically escapes the ghetto and survives most of the war, just going from place to place, town to town, foraging for food in forests, stealing from farms, things like that. He has a bunch of different run-ins with like German soldiers, Soviet soldiers, and had just this wildly improbable life and story of survival, and he actually just managed to survive the war. At one point he like loses his arm to gangrene. It has to be amputated because the doctor that he originally goes to figures out that he's Jewish and so refuses to like treat his arm injury, and then it becomes infected and he loses an arm, and then he has to go back out into the woods again, not only like learning to acclimate to this new disability of having, you know, only one arm, but also just trying to survive hand to mouth in the woods. And apparently like this man then went on after the war was over to become like a mathematics professor. He moved to Israel. He did all of these amazing things, and this book really just blew my mind. I know that there's also a film that's called Run Boy Run, same title as the book, that I believe is a foreign language film, but I really want to make sure that I can find like a good subtitled copy of it and watch the movie, because this story was just incredible. And then the last book for both the Holocaust literature and Believathon that I read was this collection called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, Children's Drawings and Poems from Terezin Concentration Camp, 1942 to 1944. I'm pretty sure the first time I heard about this book was over on Jen Campbell's channel, but this is also something that I studied when I was in college, the experiences of children in like the Terezin ghetto specifically, which was this ghetto that was designed basically to be like a model for the rest of the world of like, look how humanely treated the Jews and people living in this ghetto are, and the Nazis basically used it as a smokescreen for organizations like the Red Cross, so that they could cover up all of the like dark underbelly and things that were going on beneath this veneer of a model ghetto. I mean, that's an oxymoron in and of itself, but I guess people fell for it because they thought that it didn't seem that bad when they visited. And basically there was a woman who would hoard and smuggle art supplies into the ghetto to work with children there to create poetry and art, and she stayed there until the very end, until she herself was deported and died. But basically it was her mission to help them process the kind of things that they were going through art and poetry. And there isn't really that much I can say about this book that will really bring home how important it is. I think it's just something that you have to read for yourself, and I would highly recommend it. Okay, then I read 4 books for the IndigAthon, which is short for Indigenous Readathon. The first of those was kind of a nonfiction November overlap as well, and it's called Mamaskatch, A Cree Coming of Age by Daryl J. McLeod. This is one of those rare books that's kind of like a memoir that is so poetic and so electrifying. It's written as though it's the most compelling fiction you could think of, but in some ways it's even more amazing because it actually really happened. And this is Daryl McLeod's story of his family's experience as Native people in what's now Canada, the experiences that his mother and her sisters had at the hands of residential schools and abusive members of the Catholic Church. It's the story of his own survival of child sexual abuse and trauma, and trying to disentangle the trauma that he experienced as a child from having healthy adult relationships and coming to terms with his queer sexuality in a healthy, meaningful way. This book comes with a lot of trigger warnings, as you may have guessed, for child sexual abuse, child abuse, clerical abuse, all these different kinds of things. But this book was just amazing. I cannot believe this is the first book that he's ever written. He actually only began writing recently, now that he's retired from working for the government and for his tribal organizations. But I would definitely recommend this book. It was fabulous. Another book that I read was one that I'm actually buddy reading with Michelle, who is one of the co-hosts of the Readathon, and that is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is a sort of dystopian sci-fi speculative fiction novel that has a Dene protagonist. Dene is the word for Navajo in the language of that nation, and she is a supernatural monster hunter. She has clan powers that enable her to kind of go into this blood rage in order to defend herself and protect people, and this makes her really good as a person that is hunting down monsters in this post-apocalyptic world. There also is a bit of a romance in this story between her and Kai, who is another Dene character that also has clan powers. I'm really interested to see where this is going to go with the next book, because not everything was easily resolved by the end of the first book, and I didn't realize that this wasn't a standalone when I started reading it, so now I need to get Swarm of Locusts because I gotta know what happens. But I thought that this book was really fun. It definitely gave me some vibes of urban fantasy books, and I've only read a handful of urban fantasy books, but I think if you like that genre, you'll probably like this genre. Or you'll probably like this book. I mean, let's make it a whole genre. That would be awesome, but I meant books specifically. Then I read a poetry collection called An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo, who is the current poet laureate of the United States. This may be the best poetry collection that I've read all year. I do try and make it a point to read a few throughout the year just because I really love reading poetry. I think it's important to, constantly be exposing myself to new voices in poetry. It can be a little bit daunting, I know, if it's difficult for you to pick up a poem, but I think that these poems are written in an accessible, powerful way. And they are the story, again, like many of these books, have strong themes of family history and especially inherited family trauma at the hands of the United States government. In this case, Joy Harjo is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and her family had stories of her grandfather's experience during the forced marches and forced relocation of Native Americans during the Trail of Tears period. This book was absolutely beautiful. Again, very similar to I Never Saw Another Butterfly. I don't think I can really explain how wonderful this book is. It's kind of a thing that you just have to read for yourself, and I would highly recommend that you do. All right, and then the last book that I read, let me pull up the author's name, was also an ebook because I was trying really hard to think of something that I could read for the romance prompt for this readathon, but I really didn't want to read a romance novel that really leaned into negative racial stereotypes and stuff like that, and that was most of what I was finding through a cursory search. So I ended up actually settling on a young adult contemporary romance, and it's called Hearts Unbroken by Cynthia Leitich Smith. And This also had something in common with the previous book because the main character is also a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and she's a teenage girl that now lives in Kansas, and it is basically a story about her as a young school newspaper reporter in high school trying to cover the latest controversy that some conservative, narrow-minded parents have dreamed up to try and get kids of color out of being cast in the school musical. There's an amazing story that's going on with her and this boy that she likes who is also multiracial, and there's a lot of interesting relationship dynamics there where they're kind of okay, they're happy that they're each dating another person of color because there are some things that they don't have to explain, the way that she has to explain certain things to her white boyfriend from previously in the book, but then there's also a lot of miscommunication that happens because it's a romance story and that's what happens. I really loved the side plot, that it wasn't really a side plot by the end of the book, about her younger brother who wanted to be the Tin Man in the High School Musical, and then him figuring out that L. Frank Baum actually had some really reprehensible ideas about Native people and what the United States government should do with them. Yeah, I didn't know that until I read this book, and that was, extremely angering to read. So this was a really good book. I think that I feel a little awkward reading romances that are written for young adults, and there were a couple scenes that I had to skip over, not because I was oh, I feel uncomfortable reading a sex scene, but it's more that I felt uncomfortable reading a sex scene that was between two teenagers because I'm I don't think I need to read this, so I kind of just skipped through that a little. I'm glad that it exists in YA, and I hope that there are more well-written discussions of sex and consensual sex and stuff in YA, but when they got to the details of it, I was okay, I'm gonna just keep going here. And so that was a really good book. And then there was one game that we played this week that just came out. It is called Marvel Champions. I don't have it with me right now because the box and everything is currently dismantled out in my living room, but Marvel Champions is basically a cooperative deck building card game where you each play as a different superhero from the Marvel Comics universe, and you are teaming up against big baddies in order to defeat them, like superheroes do. So Sean and I just played the introductory adventure together. We took the pre-built deck suggestions. I played as Captain Marvel and he played as Spider-Man, and we started making our way through the basic villains. So we had one mission where we had to stop Rhino from stealing some vibranium to sell it to Hydra. The one where I died was one where we were fighting against Ultron, who can create cards that are supposed to help you into these little drones that attack you instead. It was really fun. It is definitely more simple and streamlined than the other games of its type that we usually play, but I enjoyed it very much, and I'm super looking forward to playing more of this. So that is going to do it for this week's wrap-up. If you liked this video and you would like to see more, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.